So I said I'll say something about group safety, then I'll introduce myself and get into the content. So I just kind of wanted to bring to front of mind some of what you'll probably be familiar with anyway from previous sessions you've attended, that it kind of really helps if we agree to hold a space which is safe, psychologically safe. And in doing so, the usual courtesies are kind of what we'd look for, the respect if we've got anything to ask or kind of challenge each other about that, we do that, respecting each other. We might challenge ideas but not the person, that we hold the confidentiality of the space. Not that I'm expecting anyone to share anything that is highly personal, though that may well emerge. But sometimes we kind of say things that might have a political edge or might even have some reference to our organizations, and it matters a lot that we are able to kind of ask questions and interrogate the subject without any concern that anyone's going to go back and say, oh, well, can't believe Harry said this in the session. So if we can just kind of sign up to that as a matter of principle, I think that would really, really help. Are we good to proceed with those as a set of principles? Great, thank you. So for those of you who haven't seen it, and I can drop a link to it in the meeting chat, I wrote a blog last week, which perhaps will give a bit more background information about some of the kind of ideas I'll be sharing. So you can kind of read that at your leisure. Um, yeah, just checking this right link. You can read that at your leisure. Um, what I did want to say is that it depends on what we think we've seen on the street as to how we react to it. Um, so I want to come back to that as a thing, but let me introduce myself. Just kind of waiting just in case some other people pop through. So I'm Hári Sewell, as you'll have gathered, and I've kind of been working in this field of social justice for at least 30 years. The majority of my career has been in senior roles in central government, in local government, and in the NHS. I've also been a researcher and writer and lecturer around issues to do with racial justice and social justice, and spend a lot of my time kind of just engaged in the subject. The tagline that really supports my work kind of arrived probably in conversation with someone who I kind of referenced towards the end of the session. Otto Sharma is from MIT in Boston, and he was kind of saying, you've got this way of disrupting with gentleness. I thought I like that, and I guess that is the hallmark of my career, is that kind of intellectually and in terms of the way in which I present stuff, I really try and kind of disrupt some of the things that we might just assume as the standard way, the orthodoxy of looking at the world, but it never is an attack on individuals, nor is it something that is kind of, devaluing another human being in order to kind of make a point. It very much is recognizing that we live in a society where there are these dominant ideologies and discourses that seep into us, and we often reenact things in an uncritical way, more often than not out of malice. Though on occasions we do see that, and I guess that's a reference point for why we're here. Welcome, Helen. Just kind of doing
All
the
right.
intros. It's okay. I'm glad you're able to make it. So before I put the slide deck up, having introduced myself, I just want to return to that question I posed, which is, it depends on what we think we're seeing. Because some people and some parts of the media believed they were seeing protests. And in fact, on the Wednesday, when there was kind of widespread sharing of information about some kind of street violence that was due to emerge, I know of at least one company, the Gym Group, who in their information to their customers said, due to the planned protests this evening, were closing. And it's to really misunderstand what we saw, because we didn't see protests. And that language opened up the avenue for some colleagues, often white colleagues, to see equivalences where they don't exist. So that kind of concept of false equivalences is really central here, and it runs through a lot of the discourse that emerges. where people say, well, when Black Lives Matter protests were occurring, the police didn't intervene in this manner, and they're doing it now. And this is a sign that we're seeing two-tier policing. And you might be aware that the guy who now owns X had tweeted to say, what we've got is two-tier care. And Farage also suggested that that's what we're seeing. So this kind of language of two-tier policing only emerges. Welcome, Helen. Just getting into scene setting. So we're recording the session, just so you know, but mainly just to use the audio, not the visuals. So this language of two-tier policing is kind of part of the weaponry that is used to suggest that what we're seeing is the state shifting to the left, and is kind of aligning itself with Islam, aligning itself with people of color, and that people who are white and supposedly have got an indigenous UK or British identity are being left behind. So the premise upon which it's built is fundamentally false, because we didn't see protests. And in that blog that I've dropped into the chat, I described what we saw on the streets as acts of terrorism. And when you look at the legal definition of terrorism, what it really relates to is that desire to create fear amongst others in the pursuit of some political change, and targeting, groups, religious or ethnic or racialized minorities. And I can't see how you could find any wriggle room in terms of matching up what we saw on the streets with that particular definition. It seems pretty evident to me that there were acts of terrorism. And what's kind of very striking is that language did not emerge in the media reporting, or the way in which the police or senior politicians referred to what we were seeing, despite it matching the definition so clearly. And I think that begins to tell us something about when you think about two-tier things. It's and again, in the blog I write about cultural essentialism, and I'm just kind of setting the scene here. So if you're unfamiliar with the concept of cultural essentialism, it relates to the idea that for some groups there are attributes which, when they show up, are considered to be an essential part of who they are. So we've got biological determinism and cultural essentialism. This idea that if, for example, someone of Muslim faith is accused and perhaps found guilty of an act of terrorism, it's seen as that's what people like that do. But if someone who's white does it, it's seen as an aberration. And that shows up a lot in the media reporting, but also in the way in which the reporting of the violence that we've seen on the streets has happened. And you can kind of peel back the layers by noticing that the people on the streets were referred to as the far right. And I know it wasn't exclusively men, but again, in the blog, I make this point that if you just said there were these white men out on the streets, attacking the police, destroying property, and intimidating people of racialized backgrounds, it would balk at that, because we think, well, it wasn't just white men, was it? It was just like this kind of particular group. And it is striking how rapidly we move to distancing the majority from the small group, and we immediately say these are the actions of the far right. But again, going back to the concept of cultural essentialism, it doesn't work the same way often for people who are Muslim. You might, on occasions, hear people talk about Muslim extremists, but often the dominant discourse is that this is kind of an essential quality of what it means to be Muslim. And it's just kind of helpful to understand that that's what we've been seeing playing out on the streets. So why the fallout? Let's kind of get into it so that we do have time at the end. And if there's anything I've just said that you want to ask about, as I said, just pop your hand up and feel free to interject a question. I'm fine with that. And at the end, I will kind of leave some practical tips, because these sessions aren't just about ideas, they're about what we can kind of do differently. So it kind of feels bold in some ways to have a session about surviving the fallout as if I could tell you what the fallout's going to be. Because of course, I don't have 100% predictability on it. But all I've got is over 30 years in the field, studying, kind of understanding the psychology of how things play out. And I've kind of seen it before. And yeah, maybe I have a hunch about what might happen. It may well be that not a lot happens, but we've kind of seen what's happened in the conflicts in the Middle East, and for example, the kind of sense of some people feeling silenced, the inability of some people to speak without contextualizing what they're witnessing, and it kind of creates these what I call these bidirectional conflict triggers. And I've seen many organizations struggle with the fallout from that. And I don't think that this is going to be much different, because there's a whole history of people feeling put out by these things. So what might the likely fallout be? Well, an increased sense of threat for racialized people. And this will be accentuated for women, especially Muslim women. So this might be an obvious thing to you, but that sense of physical threat is there. Walking home from work, traveling home from work on public transport, and I kind of mention the particular experience of Muslim women because the already existing hostility to a style of dress, if Muslim women choose to dress like that, but also just because of the male violence against women and that kind of sense of power imbalance, will often kind of create this greater sense of threat. And it's real. And it will disrupt things. It will disrupt the times people choose to go home, who they go home with, whether or not they choose to get picked up. It might introduce additional costs. And these things are often hidden to organizations as people try and reduce the risk to themselves and their families. And some straightforward routes or some straightforward decisions become more complicated. And it can be really frustrating and like a double hit in a way, because you've got that difficulty that you're facing in the world, but you've also got the consequences of it, and the organization might not even know or acknowledge it. So I kind of think it's worth tuning into that and trying to find out how many additional layers there are. Um, what we'll also see is a sense of mistrust, potentially, and skepticism towards white colleagues. So we saw it after the European Cup, or whenever it was. I'm not a footballer, but when the penalties were missed and there was all that kind of language, and colleagues would say to me, the problem is, I feel that some of my colleagues may well have been out in those places where those racist comments and abuse and those chants were being made, and they may well have been part of that. So you're sitting working with people, and for the purposes of achieving your organizational or team goals, you carry on working with them, but always uncertain as to what your true values are when you're not in this kind of context. But also, there is this kind of sense of white colleagues feeling that their concerns are silenced and that racialized people are always given an advantage in the debate. And that's kind of one of the challenges we've got with what people refer to as the cancel culture. This kind of idea that people become positions and we lose the ability for dialogue. So people who may well have some legitimate investigations, conversations to be had, they're just shut down. Let me give you a case in point. There may well be a place to have a conversation about immigration, um, and to understand why we have the world the way we have, and who chooses to emigrate and who chooses to um, migrate, and what are the forces behind that, and we can kind of think about that at a geopolitical level, thinking about our economic forces that kind of create inequities, think about the way in which we in the global north might trash the planet and kind of create conditions in the global north that mean people need to move. There are conversations that may well be legitimate if we say, let's kind of talk about, if you want to talk about migration and immigration, let's have the conversation and let's have it in a real deep way. So to just shut people down doesn't really achieve that goal. And what it does, it kind of builds this seething resentment often amongst white people who feel I have a legitimate concern that I'm never allowed to articulate. Otherwise, I'll be branded as being racist. So I kind of think that that is likely to be the fallout now. And it kind of links with what you'll see on some of the, well, the next slide in particular. But what we will also see, and I think this is really essential, is new alliances being formed. In Doppelganger, which was a 23 publication, anyone who reads Naomi Klein may well have got their teeth into Doppelganger. I haven't got enough time to tell you about the premise behind the book. Other than one of the central themes is the idea of diagonalists, that people form alliances across these diagonal lines that you would least expect. So one of the driving forces, she kind of points to the pandemic and the kind of coercive measures brought in by the government in order to increase the uptake of the vaccine, for example. How people on the left who have often had a lack of faith and a mistrust in government because I don't know, the way in which contracts might be meted out and things like that, that you find alliances being formed with people on the far right who also feel that actually we can't trust the government to protect our own, and what they're trying to do is to intervene in our lives and control us. So you kind of get these alliances being formed across these lines that are unfamiliar to us. But what you end up with is this kind of critical mass of these people who are now beginning to say things that hitherto we just wouldn't expect to hear from a left-leaning person. And I'm not saying that I think everyone has to be left-leaning. I'm just saying in terms of what we might consider to be familiar territory, that is shifting sand right now. And Naomi Klein sets that out very clearly. And that's kind of one of the consequences that we see in this. And another kind of concept that she speaks about is Pippicatism. And it kind of relates to this idea of the mockery that is made of, and again, there's a whole backstory as to where the word comes from, but a mockery that is made of legitimate terms or critiques around social justice. So what we now see is that kind of field being tarnished as being woke or super woke, or people being snowflakes, or before it used to be dismissed as people being politically correct. And what ends up happening is that people who have a legitimate case to make now feel that the language and the concepts that we might have evoked to explain our ideas have become so tarnished and sullied by that Pippicatism that we just no longer use that voice. We kind of have to surrender that power. I've chosen to surrender that power because of the mockery that's made of it. And then you find that people on the other side of the spectrum will take that language and say, for example, that our rights are being eroded, or that we're being othered, and so forth. So that's kind of some of the patterns that we see happening. So you get these kind of new alliances being formed where even people on the left are now saying it's all about identity politics. We need to move away from this and just love each other, as if that can address some of the things further upstream that create inequalities. The other alliances that are being formed are that people who we might have considered to be in the center ground are now beginning to see for themselves that they feel they share something emotionally in common with people who are further right, and that the people who they feel are speaking up for them are people who maybe 20 or 30 years ago would be seen as being at the extremes, at the margins and the periphery of society. And that becomes kind of problematic because you've got people in caring professions or in organizations that might articulate a set of values that we think are more aligned with social justice, with employees who see their values associated with people who are on the kind of furthest right of the spectrum. And they're working alongside colleagues who are going to be values driven around social justice, but they may also be working with population groups that are diverse and require that ability to have a very critical outlook on the world as opposed to individualizing people's problems, even though sometimes we need an individualized response, but to be able to go, but I recognize that this thing that's happening to you here and now isn't just as a result of bad decisions that you've made, but there'll be other factors that will have kind of created conditions that meant it's more likely that people in your social class or from your part of town or from your faith or from your age group or from your sexual orientation, it's more likely that people like you are going to face these challenges. We need to be able to see further upstream rather than just the individualized paradigm. And if you have people who are bringing it back to a very individualized perspective, working with our population groups that are diverse, it can be a challenge. Just to kind of say something about that kind of individualized paradigm as opposed to the kind of bigger structural stuff. There are two primary ways we can look at challenges, particularly in the caring professions, but in other walks of life. One is we look for answers in the internal conditions of either the individual or the group, or we look for them in the systemic and structural. They're not mutually exclusive, but they're different orientations. And that was what I was just trying to describe, is that what ends up happening is as we move further towards the ideology of the right, which is kind of what we saw played out on the streets, we're moving to saying that it's something to do with these people, either their culture or their biology or both, as opposed to saying, what kind of world have we created that kind of drives these conditions? It doesn't mean it removes individual accountability. It just means it helps us see that bigger picture. Because if we don't have that broader orientation, that structural and systemic analysis, what we end up doing is we just keep responding to the individual and the patterns repeat themselves because we don't at any point go, what's driving this? What's further upstream that's driving this? And that's kind of the bit that is often trashed when kind of you've got left-leaning think tanks doing that. But that's actually what saves us in the end because we spot patterns. That's what we're trying to do. So I said on the forthcoming slide, I'll put into words some of the things that you might hear. So this is kind of what I put on my social media a couple of days ago, just to summarize some of the things that you may well hear. I don't agree with what they're doing, but I understand it though. Sounds like a reasonable comment for some, saying, yeah, I get where it comes from. But yeah, hopefully later on we'll see why that's problematic. Here's the thing I was saying about the false equivalences. What I don't like is when it was a Black Lives Matter protest, you didn't see them chucking loads of people in prison. They're the kind of comments that you're likely to hear in the workplace. Or someone has to speak up for the likes of us. It's getting to the point where it's wrong to be white in our own country. And then you think, well, what's the evidence base for that? That is, this country is a mess. They let anyone in, and we're basically under attack. Then you could kind of be curious about what's the statistical evidence for that and where the majority of violence does actually come from in this country. And then that last one, I just think it's also one-sided now. I feel like I've lost my country. And again, you can kind of investigate the history as to what actually changed the face of this country and why, there are these kind of massive waves of immigration at particular points in our history and what drove that. And again, not many people pursue the history in that way. I often say most people don't expect me to go to Jeremy Paxman as a source, but in his book, The English, he says that the people who have been oppressed tend to remember their histories, and the oppressors tend to forget because there's something unpalatable about having to face up to why we are where we're at. So what are some of the psychological processes in terms of thinking about the fallout that then leads us to think about solutions later on in our session? Well, for people from black and brown, like black and brown people, racial battle fatigue is likely to really kick in again. So again, we've got an hour, so we can't get into the detail of what these things mean. I'm just kind of giving you the ideas, but it's just that kind of social defeat, that sense of being ground down by year after year after year, well, day after day, dealing with kind of the racism, whether it's the very explicit stuff or the microaggressions, that people just get ground down. And what sometimes happens when people get ground down is that you end up with a social defeat. But what you might also get is that people's tolerance becomes reduced, so their threshold for the little nonsense comments that they might have put up with a couple of years ago has become eroded. So they are more likely to snap or invoke policy and pursue their rights because, yeah, we've been around for a long time. These things wear you down. There's a heightened vigilance. So sometimes people talk about it as hypervigilance, but it might not even be hyper. It's just as heightened vigilance that you begin to listen out for and scrutinize everything that your colleagues who are white say because you're just not sure. You may well have spotted on your colleague's social media something that's kind of really problematic. Or if you've not got access to your colleague's social media, you're left wondering what they do share and what they do like. And therefore, it creates this increased vigilance. One of the good things is that we can kind of hold each other to account because of that. But one of the potential downsides is the false positives, that something sounds as though it's discriminatory, or it may well be that in another social context, we might have heard something and have treated it as a misstep, but now, because of this heightened vigilance, there is this kind of decreased capacity to just treat it as a misstep, and it's seen as a violation. So, colloquially speaking, people might up the ante. So that kind of creates conditions again where we're likely to see more invoking of policy grievances and objections in the workplace. I kind of spoke about social defeat. You will also, and this is almost inevitable, see withdrawal of self. So if people have kind of been prepared to share who they are in an organization, but they experience a degree of vulnerability in doing so because they're not sure about the makeup of their colleague, team, whatever, that the safest place to be is just to come into work, do what you have to do, and go home. And that withdrawal of self might also, as we see later on, include withdrawal of some of the kind of normal courtesies. People might not necessarily become rude, but there is just less space for those things, the kind of glue that holds our teams and organizations together. And it's worth us being alert to that, because though we can't regulate for it in terms of our organizational policy, we don't say you have to do this, but in terms of being a leader and a manager, paying attention to the process of the team, not just the outcome of a team, we would start to notice that as part of the team dynamic. Because if it's not addressed, it becomes embedded and problematic in a different way. So the double consciousness. So you might know of Du Bois' work, The Soul of Black Folks, where he kind of describes the idea of the double consciousness in America. He was talking about people of color being in society and forever living with the sense of I'm in, but I'm not. I haven't seen the film about Linford Christie, my athlete. For those of you who are interested, I've not seen the film about Linford, but I was around. I kind of know of some of the things that happened with Linford Christie, who was a 100-meter sprinter. And when he had the Britain top on, and he was a British athlete, and he was kind of celebrated for that. But when his brother was arrested, he was a Jamaican-born athlete. And that's just kind of one kind of insight into what it's like living with this double consciousness of, like, sometimes you're kind of seen as being part of society, and then in another breath, literally just like that, you're an outsider. And living with that sense can be quite fragmenting internally. So for any of you who are interested in psychiatry and mental health, you can kind of begin to see perhaps some links with kind of the high rates of admissions for psychosis for people of color, living with this double consciousness, because you're driving this wedge psychologically in people, almost having to live two lives, because of what Du Bois wrote about. So what you might find in this shift around double consciousness is a greater sense of being the outsider. And that might be unfamiliar to colleagues who've worked with someone who's kind of felt like they kind of known Hári for like 8 years, we've worked in a team, but then notice that there's kind of something that shifted, and that kind of withdrawal of self links to that shift into double consciousness. It's just kind of helpful to have these as conceptual frameworks that we can kind of have conversations with our teams or our colleagues about. But also, what we might find is an emboldened sense of being able to speak assertively about rights. And again, that might be a shift for some colleagues who have kind of been seen as like, middle of the road, assimilating into the team. And then there's this edge that emerges. And sometimes organizations and managers don't know how to deal with that. So, for white colleagues, what might we see is, as a result of what I was saying about that idea, the notion of two-tier policing, that's kind of been driven by, some of the senior politicians I've alluded to before, and some of the kind of people who manage big social media platforms, that there's this kind of sense of injustice that is created, and often people don't have a language for describing it. And you'll probably be aware that when politicians often get trounced in national elections, one of the things they say is, we've been too focused on, trying to kind of, attend to the needs of the marginalized in communities. But, what about the forgotten communities? And they kind of talk about, the red brick communities as, white working class people who are forgotten in there. That sense of injustice. But also a sense of being silenced. This idea that if people wish to articulate any concern about anything that they have a problem with from their lived experience, that's shut down. And it's really difficult to manage this dynamic, because it is right for us to have clear boundaries about what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable. But if it creates this dissent and this seething frustration, then it doesn't really achieve our goal. So, kind of thinking about where we get to at the end, kind of creating spaces where people can have deep conversations in a safe space is the thing that gets us through. And it's counterintuitive, because we often think, I don't want to be hearing this stuff. But if no one ever hears that at any point, all it does is just simmers beneath the surface. And then, like on the previous slide where I spoke about people from black and brown backgrounds, you get the sense of people being emboldened for the reasons that we know. The kind of the rhetoric about us being invaded, or sending people back on boats, or it's going to be like a hurricane. There are kind of particular phrases and ideas used by what people might be considered as mainstream stream politicians. But then you've got some people on the furthest part of the right political spectrum who, in social media and other sectors, are going to be circulating even more radical ideas that people with whom we work are reading and consuming, and probably doing so in a non-critical way. I have stories to tell about stuff I've seen from people I kind of think should know better. People who have black and brown children who will still share stuff like that because they just haven't engaged in the subject critically. Someone said directly to my face, who has got 3 dual heritage children, the country's full. We need to send people back. Um, we just need to send people back, and you kind of get left with this curiosity as, but what about your partner? And like, what about your partner's parents? How do they kind of fit into this story? And I kind of say it with a wry smile, but also just, and I use that phrase about people repeating things uncritically, that it has a sound, that has a ring to it. And that's what we see, is that uncritical reenactment of these dominant discourses. And that's what we kind of need to interrupt, slow the process down. So what we end up with are these shifts away from the center at a time of service pressure. We get these bi-directional conflict triggers. And this is kind of such a challenge. And I named the thing about service pressure because I know, like, at this point in the financial year, at this point in the budget cycle, at this point in the kind of global economic cycle, we're stressed, stretched, and stressed. So we're trying to kind of get the best we can out of people. And the thing that really liberates the best out of people is when teams work together as teams, when people kind of go that extra step in order to deliver the outcomes that we need for them to deliver. And at that point, we end up with this increased likelihood of some people kind of feeling angry and feeling disenfranchised, and other people feeling wounded and bruised. And that center ground, that tolerance, that cohesiveness becomes eroded. So what does it look like in the workplace in practical terms, the things that you might have to deal with? You get the comments that slip um, that will be deemed as being racist. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they'll be deemed as being racist. And you end up with this responsibility to adjudicate on that. And that can be a challenge because often, unless someone uses the N word or the P word, we kind of get a bit stuck. We might say it was a bit unkind, it was faultless, but was it racist or was it not? So we're going to see a lot more of that. Someone recounted an experience of a colleague saying, come on, what we really need to do is to vote for, and they named a particular political figure that was kind of on the far right. And in that comment, the person who heard that kind of felt that was an explicitly racist comment to make because they felt that that particular politician really advocated lots of policies and ideas that were racist in nature. But of course, in our caring professions, that was someone in the NHS. Whoever articulated that thing was really thinking, well, given the state of the world, what we need is someone who's going to protect our interests. So that point about how do you adjudicate on whether it was or it wasn't racist, was it a legitimate thing? If it's a existing political party in the UK and all you hear is the articulation of one of the kind of central themes, is it racist or is it just a different ideology? Welcome, thanks for joining. So the other thing that I mentioned about before is the potential, what does it look like in the workplace? The withdrawal of compassion, empathy, and niceties. And that matters a lot because people feel it. These are kind of one of the areas that is difficult to manage because if all you do is to withdraw your caring, empathic comments or kind of recognition of the difficulties of other groups, you can't, as I said before, you can't regulate for that. You don't have a policy that says you have to be kind, you have to be empathic. But colleagues feel these things. And when it becomes accumulation, it really becomes part of team culture. And I guess what I'm saying is when it's a one-off, when it's a brief thing, we can kind of let them pass. But as a leader, as a manager, sometimes we have to say, I think something's going on here. I can't put my finger on it, but it just seems as though we're not as empathic as we used to be. We're not as kind. We're just not showing the same kind of level of courtesy. What do you think, team? And name it. What we're likely to see and what it looks like in the workplace is just that statement of, well, I think rights have gone too far. And then the what about ism. So you'll kind of get, what about the working class boys in education? What about this other group? And it isn't as though there aren't legitimate cases to be made. But again, if what we tend to do is to fracture the conversation by saying, well, advances for you mean a loss for us, then it has a very simplistic zero sum way of looking at the world. And what we need to do is to be able to kind of be more critical than that and to say, well, there are systems of power that disadvantage many of the groups that we kind of name. We're pulling against each other, but maybe we can form coalitions, disenfranchised people. And if you're interested in that, you can read Emma DeBerry's book, What White People Can Do Next. moving from allyship to coalition. I just put in brackets that quote, just for those of you who might be interested in it. To people with privilege, equality feels like an injustice. I can't attribute it because I'm not really sure where it comes from, even though I've looked. But that phrase, I think, summarizes a lot, and you can kind of use it in relation to any form of privilege. Just so you know, for the record, I'm not someone who kind of talks about white privilege in my work. I made a decision to not, because I think that that term has become so weaponized and it's become so toxic for many people that they become concerned with the particular terminology rather than the ideas behind it. So I talk about whiteness as an advantage marker, because if you use that phrase, it isn't like a polemic view. I'm not saying from my point of view, I think you have this thing. Whiteness as an advantage marker just says, when you look at it statistically, the evidence will tell you that being born into white skin creates these advantages, not by your choice, not because of us doing anything right here in 2024, that there's a whole history that has created this advantage. So whiteness is an advantage marker that is supported by like the stats for whatever sector or field you're in. You'll see that. And it isn't accusatory. It's just a kind of statement of this is what the stats tell us. Now you could then say, well, why is that? And that's what I like is the curiosity. Let's be curious about what's driving it, and not just leave it as a simple statement or something that feels accusatory. So what it looks like in the workplace is that decreased tolerance amongst Black and brown people, and that increased rate of grievances and complaints. So that's why we're kind of here. It's because this is what it looks like. So what might we do? So leadership in this is essential. So there's often a desire to play the long game and just see if it fizzles out. There's a desire sometimes to just be avoidant because we know that you don't have a right answer. Um, and what I'd be encouraging all of us to do is to be proactive in this. I mean, it's almost like a given, and that's why you're here, is because you're trying to be proactive, which is great. But to kind of go back and advocate to the organizations who might not want to release a statement, who might not want to say anything in the hope that it'll just kind of die away, that it doesn't really help in the long term, because what it does, it normalizes the idea that there can be things that really matter to our workforce, and we can just kind of choose to look away in the hope that it won't bother us too much. One of the things we can do, and yeah, this is kind of so important, is to speak about diversity leading to thought diversity. When I do my work and I make this following statement, people are often surprised because it kind of seems as though I'm being off message to myself. And the statement is, when you increase diversity, you increase the likelihood of conflict. And it sounds like a wrong message to give, but it is the reality. Is by definition, if you bring together a group of different ways of seeing the world, different ways of being, different histories, you increase the chances of conflict. If everyone's kind of come from the same village, likes the same food, likes the same film, got the same faith, speaks the same language, all those kind of obvious things, then of course it's easier to gel, right? Um, And that's the reality. And I kind of think it would be really helpful for leaders in organizations to name this, that there are a lot of benefits for creating diversity. Some of them you'll know from research about increased productivity and the ability to reach our target groups and all that. But it's likely to increase conflict. And therefore, what we have to do is to put measures in place to almost like ameliorate those kind of risks of conflict. We can't just like create diversity and walk away and say it looks good. So I think we should name that more explicitly. I think it's really important to increase that language of social justice. So even debates around the rights of white people can take place in the context of social justice. So if there's a kind of pushback against immigration or kind of anything like that, if you kind of think about prison, right? Unless you are at the extremes of society, you would still say human beings, and this is more like a human rights argument, that human beings have rights. And even if you feel that there should be some penalty, that you'd still want people to have their rights protected. And given the kind of people with whom most of us in this room work, then social justice, paying attention to human rights, needs to be key and essential. And I think that that is a gateway to tuning into that part of people who just want to use sound bites and other ways of dismissing the humanity of others to bring them back to, well, we're a human rights based organization. We're interested in social justice, meaning we're looking upstream, we're understanding power and how power has been brought to bear, creating kind of outcomes we've got today. So, yeah, I think that's kind of a really good leadership act to take the conversation to the workforce. The other thing that I think is kind of really important here is to focus. Well, yeah, I think that was on the slide. So I'm going to go through all of these. So we've got these other three to go, and then we finish, right? So focusing on aligning the culture with the values and mission. And I guess what I mean by that is to really think about how we get on as an organization or as a team, and think about the people who we are serving, client facing, whatever language we use. And if we're trying to be inclusive in the way in which we work with the end user, what do we need to do culturally? What needs to be our cultural norm about valuing the rights and the humanity of each other for us to be able to be authentic in working directly with the people who we serve? And just be really clear that if the language being used in any interaction between colleagues is derogatory about a group, that by definition, that's going to be a problem, because you're beginning to introduce some ideas of dehumanizing a particular group. Kind of going back to the thing about cultural essentialism or biological determinism, we're beginning to dehumanize another group on the assumption that you can kind of go, because you look like this or dress like this or sound like this, you belong to a group who is of lesser value. So we're basically spotting anything that hints that someone believes that there is some kind of hierarchy. So even if you're having a conversation about migration, as I say, you can still do that whilst respecting that everybody is a human with human rights. Any language that diminishes the other is a problem. So that's a gateway for our managers and leaders to just listen out for that. And do that thing about focusing on how we wish to be, and to make it the manager's business to, spend time with the team and say, how do we want to be? There's a lot going on in the social world. There's a lot going on at the geopolitical level. How do we want to be as a team? Do we want to gel? Do we want to trust each other? What do we want to do when someone says something that we find as a kind of a trigger or we find discriminatory? How do we want to deal with that? Because going back to point one, diversity is going to create an increased likelihood that at some point someone's going to misstep. And how do we want to hold that together as a team? Be proactive in that. Provide tools. So there are a couple that we can kind of put out there. Otto Scharmer's Four Levels of Listening, or Marshall Rosenberg's Nonviolent Communication. I'm sorry, I've got two men as people with some tool sets there. So Otto Scharmer's Four Levels of Listening, he kind of get us to practice listening from a place of curiosity, working towards empathy. You can kind of find it on his own website. There's a lot on the internet about the four levels of listening, including some videos and talks from Otto Scharmer. So he's the one I said I was in conversation with from MIT. And basically, the first level is downloading, where we're listening and we've got a story in our heads. So as someone speaks, we're not listening for something fresh. We think we know what someone's going to say. In a colloquial way, I say, you probably have those encounters where you've met someone who's new to the organization, and you say to a colleague, "Oh, have you met Bill from IT?" And someone's like, "Oh yeah, such a pain, isn't he? He always goes on." And you kind of, "Oh, wow, that isn't what I was going to say. I was actually kind of saying, he's the most friendly person I've kind of seen, and it's like a shame he hadn't been appointed years ago. And that's an example of when people are into downloading. They're not listening to what you're going to say. They've got the story in their heads, and they lead with that. And we do that in multiple ways. So we can kind of practice moving away from downloading to factual listening, where, like, as a researcher, you're listening for disconfirming information. Actually, is there something I haven't thought of? That's a curious way of listening. Empathic listening is the next level, where we're like, I'm not just curious, but I'm curious to know what it feels like for you, which can work in both directions. So even for people of color who feel, staff or white are telling a story and kind of, oh, shut up, maybe we can just kind of listen and say, well, what does it actually feel like? Because maybe there's something we can kind of do differently. And then you get to generative listening, where maybe we can kind of do something which is new, we haven't thought of before. So that's that. With Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, we can share this as a tool for our teams to move away from accusation and defensiveness to saying, can we have conversations where we just say, that thing you said, can we talk about that? That hurt. It made me feel this, and I got like some needs around feeling valued. And I wonder if in future you could watch this or read this. You use this particular word. I wonder if you could kind of check out this very short blog that explains why it's problematic. I'd really value if you could come back and tell me what you made of that. And that ability to be in conversation, to stay connected, and to not just cancel people is really helpful in that framing of nonviolent communication developed by Marshall Rosenberg. Again, in an hour session, wasn't expecting to kind of talk you through it in detail, just to say there are these tools we could share with our managers to say, if you use this, you can kind of change the way in which conversations take place, so it doesn't just end up with adversarial positions. And then how might we support our managers or ourselves to be clear about what is acceptable and what isn't? And I think the key question here is, what's the underpinning philosophy of the group or the ideology that someone's referencing? So where someone says, oh, yeah, I don't agree with what they've done, but I kind of get what they're doing. It's like, but what are you saying? Are you saying you really appreciate that underpinning philosophy that is built around dehumanizing other people, and believing in the kind of supremacy of others? Are you saying you believe in that ideology of a hierarchy? So that question is a good lead in whenever you get those kind of comments and you kind of think, I'm not sure. It's like, what part of it, what part of the ideology is it that you're saying you feel some connection to? The other thing is to ask what you're saying here that you'd love to see to kind of go back to a different kind of Britain, like, the UK version of MAGA. If that ideology won out, how would that align with our values as an organization? And then the last is, if researched ideas were driving what you're saying rather than your emotions, what would your ideas look like for solving this thing? So you might want to send them back. You might want to close the country, close the borders. All it's like they're bite-sized phrases. But if you're going to articulate your set of ideas based on something that you've read, what would those ideas look like as things that could be practically implemented? Yeah, that's kind of it, really. Literally, that's the last slide. So hopefully there's some kind of little practical tips. That last slide, in simple terms, you just go to someone. I'm not just interested in what you think, I'm interested in why you think what you think. So when you get those bidirectional conflicts, you can bring people together and just ask these questions and see whether we can kind of unearth some of the challenges. So thank you so much for joining the session today. So yeah, I know some of you might need to rush off immediately. That's me done. But if you wish to ask a question, pop it in the chat or unmute.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hári.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hári. Look, I need to go to prepare for another meeting that predates this one, unfortunately, but I will be following up if that's okay, to contact with you, because I think our organisation needs some support around that. So thank you so much.
Okay, no, you're welcome.
Just a question, were there any slides, Hári?
Yeah. I don't know whether or not you could see as I was moving through them, but there are slides, and for people who are here, you can have access to the slides. Yeah, I'll send them.
Thank you. Great, thank you.
Thanks, Hári. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Helen.
Thank you.
Really good.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Made a lot of sense, and I'm sorry for being late.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. See you
I'll
soon.
stop
Bye
the
now.
recording. Yes, see you soon.
Thank you, Hári, and apologies for the visitor.
Okay, all right. I know that's fine. These things happen.
Have a lovely evening. That was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Great. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing I just wanted to check. And